several abortion cases that are going to be coming up from now and then this course. Well, that's for sure one. Be interesting to see how he rules. There's going to be a gun. We're going to give all these free handouts. There's going to be a major gun suit that reaches the Supreme Court. They just agreed to hear it. The people from Sandy Hook, imagine that rings a bell. Those kids were just slaughtered at Sandy Hook, you know, the shooting over the past 3 or 4 years ago. In fact, we just had the anniversary of that. Parents of Sandy Hook, New York, who lost their children in that mass killing, have now sued the makers of the gun. Here's your free handout. So glad you're doing that. And they are suing on the grounds that the advertisement, their advertisement was a critical force in the killing of those kids. And the Supreme Court has agreed to hear this. It's not being fast-tracked, but it's being appealed, and they've agreed to accept the appeal. There is also an opioid case coming up that will really test the Supreme Court's mettle on power of opioid corporations in basically buying contracts, okay? So, and there may be another health insurance case coming. So, in fact, it is. A lower court has argued with a conservative circuit appellate court judge has ruled that all of the Obamacare program is illegal on the grounds that one component of it is. And the appeal is going to the court, and the court's accepted it. Is the entire act unconstitutional just because one portion of it is? Okay. So there's a lot going on. Here you go. Here's your free handout. We'll be getting those cases. We'll be referencing them as the decisions come down. One of our last sessions deals with. Now, let me update you on 2 things that are up here. Test 2, a strange update. Unlike my promise, I'm not giving you back your papers today. I've got a problem with a couple of papers that I need to discuss with students if I can find them. And I'm a strong believer in student privacy, so just don't press me for more details. But I've submitted your midterm grades. I'm sure you've seen them. Have they not been posted? Yeah, okay. Everybody should have been good. They're out there. Have you looked, or have they not been posted?
I didn't know.
They've been posted? Okay.
I didn't know we had midterm grades.
A lot of universities dispense with midterm grades because the students never check them. Okay, but at any rate, you have a right to know where you stand. And so they submitted and they're posted, okay? But what I'm gonna do, certainly by Sunday afternoon, probably by even tomorrow afternoon, I'm gonna send each of you an individual email, not a listserv, individually to you, so it's private. And it will just recap how I arrived at your midterm grade. I will remind you what you got on test 1, a couple of you took makeups. I'll give you your grade on that. I will rehash how you did on test 2, and then I'll show you how I arrived at your midterm grade, okay? So in other words, I don't want to hold up your access to how you're doing because I just got some conversations to occur. And then I'll have all that done by the time, I'll either have done that or I won't be getting it done by the time we meet after the spring break, okay? But I don't want you to have to wait a week to 10 days to know how I arrived at your midterm grade. So I apologize for the hold up on that. But student privacy is a big issue for me, you know? And there are limits to it, but or any kind of common sense doctrine is really something to be respected and given a lot of leeway to. All right, so that's the strange thing too. All right, some stuff on the syllabus. I want to emphasize that on the syllabus, the two things that will happen. One stipulated in the syllabus. If you want me to critique a rough draft of your paper, I've got to get an email to me or give me the hard copy on March 28th. I won't be critiquing if I get them after. You're not obligated to send it to me. You're not obligated to use it on this. You can just submit it in return, no problem. But if you'd like some feedback with no grade or just my reaction, suggestions for how to make it better, whatever, I gotta have it by March 28th, stipulated syllabus. Also, that's my date for giving you the study questions for test 3. Okay? So you've got plenty of time to work on them. I won't give them to you at the last minute that one. In other words, you will really know what to prepare for test 3. There's a lot of material in a lot of cases, but this allows you to really gear up and focus on it without wondering what else is going to be on. Then also to just typing errors that are in the syllabus for tonight's cases. For Lemon versus Kurtzman, Val, I put in the wrong page numbers. The page number is 228. Just one of the page syllabus. And for Roe v. Wade, the correct page number is in Val is page 438. Okay. Now, this is an interesting part. Kind of fun part. Here's so everybody can see this. I want to put forth some kind of big ideas to frame the conversation tonight. But really not in any of your readings, but stuff I feel pretty strongly about. Okay. Tonight, with just these cases, these are the only ones we're going to do, which almost brings us up to date. Almost, just short of two cases. We're going to continue seeing how a liberal defense of individual rights coming from the court. It continues, but you're going to start to see more and more of a conservative interpretation of individual rights beginning to eclipse as different people come out of the court as appointed by different presidents, okay? Particularly Bush 2 and Reagan, and then by the end of the term, by Trump. We're going to see slowly the reaction against the individual approach to rights and more of a conservative approach to individual rights as the court makeup changes. But it isn't going to change whack. All right? The non-whack is a function of these all members of the court, regardless of their political orientation, are intelligent people, well educated. So they will do things that appear politically inconsistent from time to time because of how they read the law on different issues. But also, they change. No problem. Hope mine doesn't do that. No problem. Don't forget that when Hugo Black went on in the court in the late 30s, he had had a 30-year experience as a member of the KKK. And then he winds up a huge force in all the civil rights cases, okay? Pro-civil rights. So justice has changed. And then some don't. James F. Burns went on the court at Europe one, where he was at best a moderate on race, but also very pro-New Deal legislation. And after he leaves Washington and goes back to South Carolina, quasi-retired, he becomes a strong defender of the segregation status quo. So, if anything, it illustrates that members of the court are human beings. They can be contradictory, they can change, whatever. And the little piece I just gave you, this thing, clearly suggests that Roberts is the Chief Justice, the current Chief Justice, is in a state of flux. As he is worried about how his legacy on the court will be perceived, as opposed to his loyalty to a certain political ideology behind behind his appointment. Okay? Now, but this article also suggests that he's never gonna really leave a conservative approach. And the fine on is how he defines conservative, not you and me. Okay? And not the man who appointed him, George W. Bush, but what he thinks a conservative is. That's a big question. And imagine if I polled all of you and then grilled you, you give me a different definition, wide ranging, the rainbow colors of what a conservative is. And you do the same with the liberal. What is a liberal? You probably give me the popular culture version, and then being analytical, you cut down and come up with more analytical over time. And there's every indication that the current Chief Justice is struggling with that and his conscience. We'll see how it goes. All right. As this, here's your free handout. Not like a quarter like that. Get it, go sit down. As this hit and miss, fits and starts transition occurs, but it is a transition. You're going to notice within the opinions that we're looking at tonight, two things that you haven't seen much of before. Some illustrations of it, but not a lot. One, you're going to see the outcome, yes, slowly shifting. There'll be a gradual increase in the momentum of the outcome towards the conservative political position. But at the same time, you're going to see intense debates within the justices themselves, debates within the conservative bloc, debates within the liberal bloc. Liberals disagreeing with liberals, conservatives disagreeing with conservatives. Okay? You'll find, like, liberals have a 5-4 decision. Conservatives control the 5, liberals take the 4. And the 4 will write dissenting opinions from the majority opinion. But they'll write those dissenting opinions for different reasons. Okay? And in the majority cases, maybe the 5 will line up to take the conservative. They'll control the opinion, but they'll give totally different reasons for how they got there. And to me, that is a potent indicator of our movement towards the polarized society that we have today. Okay? Where, unfortunately, the vast majority of American citizens of different political views don't want to hear what the other side says, which is the breakdown of the democratic process. And you combine that with what Bush versus Gore book says, that the whole electoral system, college system is just, the voting system is broken. You align that with our political polarization, and we're in a mess. Okay. And superimpose on top of that the high technology revolution that lets any foreign entity with an iPhone manipulate the outcome of electoral votes. Not only can you set off an IED or alarm with your iPhone, you can manipulate the voting of arguably the most powerful nation in the world. Put that alongside our polarization. That's the ultimate outcome of the issues are no longer even clear to liberals and conservatives. You see a 5 vote, and there'll be different reasons for the 5 and different reasons for the 4. So watch for that, and I'll point it out as we go there. All right. You've seen it before, but not in the magnitude that you're going to see it now. And I think you're going to see it in April. when Robert's Court comes down with some decisions that we'll be talking about. Especially if we get to, what is it? Attorney generals of 25 states have now sued to block Trump's emergency order on the law. Right. They're coming up through 4 different circuits. If any of you people have gone fishing before, you know the more lines you got in the water, the greater chance you got of catching something. And if you don't put a line in the water, you can go home with no food, okay? Or no fish. Well, there are a lot of lines in the water right now. One of those is going to make it to the Supreme Court, if not all of them, on Trump's emergency provision. And there will be a suit to see his income taxes. The House moved yesterday to start that process. He certainly will fight it. So there'll be a privacy issue over that. And there will be a suit over whether or not the president has to respond to a request to appear before Congress and answer under oath key questions. Because his lawyers don't want him to go because they don't know what he'll say. Okay. So all of these. Now the last one probably will not hit the court until after this class is over. But I think there's a good chance the income tax case will. I don't think Roberts will leave that hanging out there. It's an original jurisdiction issue, and he can just reach down and say, well, we've got it. And it will not have to necessarily go through an appellate process. So watch the divisions within the blocks, not just the different blocks. All right. Something totally different from that, it would seem, but not. I've got up here the topic, the conversion of Ronald Reagan. Really not discussed in any of the readings I gave. But I want to talk about that a little bit because it has a whole lot to do with his taking Rehnquist, one of the most ideologically conservative people ever on the court, and beautifully educated. Okay, right? You don't get into the Stanford Law School without being really smart, and you don't get out at the top of the Stanford Law School without being really, really, really smart. Okay, people turn down Harvard Law School to go to Stanford. I mean, there's no question the guy was super smart. But ideologically conservative. And he figures into a lot of the cases we have tonight, particularly this one. And I want to talk about the conversion of Ronald Reagan as a backdrop to, Nixon appointed Rehnquist to the court, but Reagan moves him up to the chief. So, here's my story of Ronnie. I've made allusions to him before, characterized him as having a magical sense for big issues. You can just grasp, total impatience with him, even to the point of not even wanting to run his own cabinet meetings and then having to prime him with 3x5 cars just so he could get through an agenda. Okay. But some intuitive brilliance on what ideas were still and what ideas weren't. I want to go a lot deeper on that right now. Now, if this interests you, there's been books written about this, but there's also, it's all over the internet. If you just Google the conversion of Ronald Reagan, you run into a lot of stuff that relates to what I'm talking about here, if this interests you. All right. Comes out of a small college in Illinois. Big in athletes. Before he finishes college, he's got a job doing play-by-play football and baseball calling on the radio. He's got a great voice for radio. An even better voice for the technology right ahead called TV. Okay. I know you think it's archaic. What's the name of that prehistoric thing you got on your sweatshirt back there? What's the name of that prehistoric thing?
Dinosaur in particular.
Yeah, that's what the TV is now, okay? It's all imperfect, okay, compared to the internet. So, but he's got some innate skills that if managed appropriately can have huge impact. He makes his way to Hollywood in the 30s. And doesn't have the level of talent to make it at a time when Hollywood probably has more highly talented star power than it's ever going to have. Because we're in the pre-TV, pre-internet period, and Hollywood dominated public culture in America. Dominated the minds, dominated the money. Okay? There's no competition. The radio, okay, the radio. But that's not visual. We need something visual. Mind slipping it off, thank you. I've had a hard time. All right, so he goes out there, and he's very charming and good looking, and he marries a well-established actress who's already made a lot of money. Okay. A woman named Jane Wyman. She'd been married a couple times before, had a couple children, and the marriage lasts about 9 years. Matter of fact, the house they had in the mid-30s, late 30s, just sold in Hollywood for, I think, $9 million, which is not a lot for that area, but it's still, you can Google it and see it. It's a beautiful place. Okay. 5 bedrooms. Okay. Okay. Classic Hollywood, Spanish-looking home built in the early 30s. All right. Problem is, he is a radical, wild-eyed, FDR, pro-labor union liberal. And she is an arch anti-Republican. We talk about politics interrupting relationships today. Well, she left him because he was a labor union organizer. He organized the unions for all of the starlets who couldn't get work in the heyday of the movies. And he literally unionized Hollywood. The producers and the owners and the funders hated him. He's like a Eugene Debs pulling off a railroad strike, okay? He is, I mean, if he were doing that today, Trump would call him a socialist. He wouldn't call him a communist because that's what Putin did, but he called him a socialist, okay? Just giving rabble-rousing speeches and a good organizers of not quite baited actors and actresses. As soon as they made big money, most of them forsook the union and just did what the producers told them to do, and they got the big checks, okay? Which is often what Reagan does. Right? He is such a radical left that when the second Red Scare, the first in the 20s, the second one occurs in the late 40s, 46, 47, 48, but Joe McCarthy is, saying everybody's a communist, follow me, and I'll cleanse the United States of the communist story. You all know something about it. Reagan is way up at the top of McCarthy's hit list. Of course, at the top was none other than Black David Eisenhower, okay, which shows the stupidity of his list. Okay, Eisenhower didn't belong in there, but if you're going to put a bunch of wild-eyed liberals on there, that's what Reagan was. Right? And Reagan was blacklisted. The conservatives in Washington particularly Joe McCarthy, put pressure on all the Hollywood moguls to simply not hire union organizers and liberals. They couldn't get work, and that just made Reagan more liberal. Okay, anti-conservative establishment. He makes a few movies. One that got the most notoriety, not for being good, but because of its title, came out around 1951. It was called Bedtime for Bonzo. And he plays the role of a PhD psychologist, some sort of social scientist at a university who, working with his faculty member spouse, decides that he wants to see if he can form a human relationship with a chimpanzee named Bonzo. The problem is, it's not written as a serious social science movie, it's written as a comedy. And the bottom line is, sitting around the living room at night, he was never able to teach Bonzo that when he said, Bonzo, it's time for you to go to bed, Bonzo would not go to bed. Okay. Something you hope your child gets the point on, or your dog, or anybody else. When it's time to go to bed, you're supposed to. Bonzo never got the point. Well, the movie became a laughing stock, and Reagan was really embarrassed. It sold well because it was so stupid, but they made so much money off of it that the producers wanted to make a sequel called, I don't know what, Bonzo Goes to Graduate School, I don't know what it was, okay, but something after Bonzo doesn't go to bed, okay? And Reagan declined. He was embarrassed. 2 years later, some people who had seen him in Bedtime for Bonzo knocked on his door and changed his life. The vice president for marketing for the entire General Electric Corporation, GE, which was selling everything in post-war America they could sell that had electricity in it. Even electric chairs for the death penalty. Toasters, refrigerators, for everything that Americans needed after surviving the Depression and either losing people or surviving World War II. The consumerism that ran so rampant in the 20s, reacting to World War I. Whew. Wow, I survived. I need to buy 4. Gotta get 1. Gotta have 2 maybe, okay? The same thing happens in the late 40s and 50s. It's another surge of consumerism, and we will loan you the money once a year if you can't afford it. You could even buy a toaster all the time, okay? So General Electric, no longer dominant force. The digital world is just, I mean, I don't know if you looked at GE stock lately, but it ain't doing well. They just diversified too late. US Steel diversified. They moved into plastics to compete with the Japanese plastic cars that were coming in. Okay, GE just didn't diversify. They just thought people would always want electric toasters rather than, I don't know if it's a digital toaster or not, but there sure will be someone who comes up with the idea sooner or later, okay? All right. But GE is just hot as a multinational corporation at this time. And the VP for marketing approaches Ronald Reagan about hosting a TV show they're going to put on. The new medium, TV. I think you're made for TV. And indeed he was. His presidential speeches are just unbelievable. Okay? You disagree with them, majestically delivered, whether you agree with them or not. We're going to have a Sunday night program, kind of like one of these Sunday night programs that gives the classics out of England or something like that. Okay, We're gonna have the GE Theater on Sunday nights. We're gonna ride this new technology all the way up. And we're gonna infuse the American public's mind with how wonderful all GE appliances are. And we would like you to host this. We want you to sit in an armchair, wear a sweater, be supremely avuncular, introduce the programs. Every now and then, at his request, we will let you act in them. No, they privately, the memos are in the files. They didn't think he was a good enough actor to participate, but they love the fact that he could welcome the people out of the living rooms of America onto the GE set and sell toasters or whatever they were selling. Now, the quality of the programs for the GE Theater were fantastic. They had serious drama, they did Shakespeare, they did a Romeo and Juliet, they would do some famous westerns, okay? It was all stage production that had been rehearsed. Rarely would the people in the audience see it live, but I mean, they did a lot of editing. But each one was uniquely produced for the GE Theater. And Reagan became the name behind the GE Theater. And in 3 years, he went from being a jilted, broke actor and radical left to being a millionaire many times over with a new marriage to guess who? Nancy. Okay? His wife for the rest of his life. Obviously a very good, close relationship. And that money just got him. Reminds me of a friend of mine who grew up Baptist. He married a wealthy woman who was a Methodist. And I asked him about why he became a Methodist. He said, the religion is just so much better. Okay? Write that check. All right. So, he had never, as a young radical, he had never understood corporate America and the horrible things it did to the average individual. Once he was worth millions, he really understood the goodness of corporate America. Not only did he embrace, and there's nothing like the converted to have limitless enthusiasm, okay? Because the recently converted knows no limits to the idea. Okay, you're just filled with enthusiasm. They sent him on tours of all the GE factories to preach his new anti-union message. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Unions are really bad. Okay? It's the free enterprise system that works. And unions are anti-free enterprise. As if any of those corporations were free enterprise. They were living off deals they got out of Congress by contributing money to Congress. That's not exactly free enterprise, okay? That's called corporate welfare. That's not free enterprise. Still, he becomes like an arm of the human resource management for GE, going around trying to convert all of the GE labor that's manufacturing this magical toaster back to the Gilded Age concept of the more the corporations make, certainly it will trickle down to all of the labor. Yeah. And they just love it. We'll give you $5 million next year, not $2 million, because the pro-union movement within the GE factories just dissipated. Well, that's enough to make the converted feel like they got moral certitude on their side if double your salary in a year and a half. And he became close to the corporate management of GE. A bunch of really well-educated corporate engineers, obviously they were social conservatives. kind who, a decade earlier, would have used 14th Amendment due process to advance business, not labor. And they gave Reagan, they put him through a type of indoctrination that he fully accepted. They gave him books to read on the virtues of survival of the fittest. This basically was social Darwinism propaganda on corporate life. And that welfare or all that stuff that FDR put out there is unnatural. It upsets the balance of free enterprise, laissez-faire. That show ran for 15 years, and for 12 of those years had some of the highest ratings in any television in America. On TV, the movies had lost out to TV. So he was right. He failed in the old state-of-the-art technology, but though it was at its peak when he failed. But he was succeeding magically as part of corporate America with the new technology, TV. Continued to live with Nancy, a very happy marriage in California. And ultimately, he winds up running for governor. I mean, his name recognition is just huge. It's bigger than John Wayne. He's elected governor of California and begins to practice what he's been converted to, or what he's self-converted to, whatever. And he gets huge notice in the conservative press, etc. And after 2 terms as governor, Nancy's encouragement, and certainly the encouragement of corporate America, the plan is set. He's going to go to different Republican nominating conventions, make brilliant speeches endorsing whoever's going to win, go all over the country, sponsored by the Republican Party, paid to make speeches in every little Lions Club, every little Optimist Club, every little Rotary Club in America, talking about the virtues of the Republican Party to defeat the Communists and the Democratic Party. I saw him when he came to Birmingham. Someone took me to Rotary Club where he was. Always with dark pants and a light colored sport coat. Always. I guess some Hollywood person, somebody said, this way, and a blue shirt. That was like his uniform. Always a light colored sport coat, like a Palm Beach. I have one, and I call it my Reagan coat. Okay. So I thought about it, I would have worn it for you months so you can see it. It has the American flag on the belt. Okay. Now, so he was off and running. He was made for corporate America. But long before he ran for president, he wasn't being manipulated. These were his personal, deeply felt convictions. He just changed. Okay? Now, the large bank account certainly didn't discourage the change. Notoriety did, but you can't argue that he was always manipulated by corporate America. He just changed. So, by the time we get up to the mid-1960s, it's made to order for Ronald Reagan. The 60s upheaval, the liberals' emphasis on individual rights, civil rights, gay rights, women's rights, Hispanic rights, rights. All the people who've been left out of the American dream. There was a backlash that followed that. Now, you got Gallup polls starting in 1934. So you can track public opinion. You have scientific data on what percentage of the population is part of the pro-liberal version. And that should be put in, liberal should put in quotation marks, because all these people are promised certain rights. By implication, actually, that's the conservative position. Just do what the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence says. That's as conservative as it gets. Okay? But we call it liberal. The polls show that like 65% of the citizens of the voting citizens of the United States approved of the 60s changes. But there's that other 30% or so that deeply resented it. And along this time, George Wallace is building his movement out of Alabama. He's going national. I mean, he could easily tap into this because it wasn't 30% in Alabama that resented the changes. It was 90. Okay? Not 90% of all citizens, but 90% of voters. And Wallace spotted it first and started going national to manipulate the resentment about the changes into a national political movement. Nixon comes in, wins, and then is scared to death Wallace is going to beat him in the next election. Okay? Either as a Democrat or as an independent that splits the Republican vote. So Nixon begins to, the Southern strategy begins to shift the Republican Party to the right. Reagan goes to the convention, strongly endorses Nixon with his silver tongue speaking ability. And by the time you get to Nixon's infamous downfall or the Watergate, Reagan's ready. Someone's got to pick up the mantle. Okay? And Gerald Ford assumes the presidency and then does the disastrous pardons Nixon, does not have the personality to keep the thing going. And all this grassroots campaigning that Reagan had been doing for others now pays off. Every Rotary Club, every Civitan in America had been literally addressed by Ronald Reagan over the last 6 years. The Republican Party hadn't picked up the tab of its travel, hotel, etc. Free for you, the Rotarians of Mobile. We have a good speaker for, and we will pay for it. So, he's ready. Here we move into the current situation. He had never shown any real interest in religion at all. It's just not in his Bible, pre-conversion. But he did have this insane, just magical ability to spot big issues that will sell. In 1960, the modern birth control pill. Big breakthrough. Birth control, like condoms and that kind of stuff, been around since 3000 BC. But the magical little pill that women were to take, not men, is on the market by 1961, which raises the issue of a woman's right to control her own body and the whole idea of birth control. Instantly, some states made the selling or even the free dispensing of birth control illegal. Every kind of birth control, from the most historic all the way up to the new pill. No condom, no diaphragm, no pill. Connecticut, of all things, was the first. I say Connecticut, you think of New England, you think of liberal, okay, all right. The Catholic population of Connecticut in 1964 was 40% of the voting population. And they were well organized in the Connecticut legislature. And they got a law through banning the pill. They banned all type of contraception following the orders of the Pope. Separation of church and state? I doubt it. Okay. All right. And what's so interesting is all those pockets of conservative political thought in America that it's so long been anti-Catholic. Oh, the Pope's gonna ruin everything, you know, strongly anti-Catholic. America has a strong strain of anti-Catholicism in it until the abortion or the birth control pill comes along. And Reagan spotted the ability to use birth control and ultimately abortion as a way of expanding the voter base of the Republican Party. He had the corporations. So long as Wallace was blocked, he had Southern Party. But he had to get in that long FDR base of what we call, I hate the term, I'll repeat that, blue collar labor. The hard hats. And in the Northeast, a lot of that was second generation Catholic immigrants. Okay? So he wells that into his campaign when he runs and is elected in 1980, taking office in early 1981. And so the number of people who suddenly identify with the National Republican Party, the blue collar labor is there, it shifts back. It began to shift back after 68, and it really shifts back to the Republican Party when Reagan adds that urban Catholic sensitivity to the Southern white racial sensitivity, to the corporate sensitivity about, we just don't like all these government regulations, we like government to help business, not other people. And you put that together, it was just magic. He had it. And Rehnquist is supposed to make sure the court understands that. If you need to go, let you go. I'm not competing with Chernobyl or whatever. You all going to the lectern?
Yes.
Go, whenever you, just don't worry about it, okay, go. Don't worry about it, okay. All right. If you all need to do it, do it. There's a big lecture tonight. I don't know what the grade, you all do what you need to do, no problem. Okay, so, finally, before we get to the cases, I want to go over the ideas that I'm sure anyone who's taken American historiography class is familiar with the writings of one of the greatest historians ever, Daniel Borstin, Borstin, who wrote a 3-volume history of America called The Americans, which is just Pulitzer Prize winning, just it's filled with dominant of American history thereafter. And it's very relevant to the story we have in these cases. Okay. So, the name is Daniel Borstin. I'm asking you to read it as the 3 volumes comprise about 1,600 pages. Okay. Here's a 3-minute summary. On the surface, it looks like just a narrative history of America from Jamestown up through the 1960s. The guy became so famous, he's made Library of Congress and just totally updated Library of Congress, where it just functioned like it never functioned before. Brilliant administrator too. All right, here's the guts of that 3-volume work. 1, a conflict between pragmatism and practicality and principle has undergirded everything in American history. Most products of the Western tradition, England, France, for much of Germany, major exception, of course, being maybe the fascist period, and for Italy, for most of Italy, major exception possibly being the fascist period, and Spain, major exception being the fascist period leading up to World War II. Those countries have, and certainly Greece and Turkey, from which the classical Roman, the Greco-Roman traditions have evolved. But they had deep feeling for certain guiding principles that translated into political ideas that they were wedded to. And it provided stability in crisis for them. But because of the unique development of Anglos in North America that come to this island. They slaughter the opposition, the red people. They have abundant natural resources. They're not being regulated by anything, and they got this English bureaucracy that's out there totally ineffectual. They are a frontier people once you get beyond the East Coast cities. And frontier life always justifies the means. Please, Mr. Custer, I don't want to go. There's an Indian way out there and he wants to take my hair. Please, Mr. Custer, I don't want to go. Son, go out there and take his hair. And you damn Mr. Custer. With the Johnny Horton song, okay? Please, Mr. Custer, I don't want to go. Go out there and take his hair. My point is that because of the unique experience of the way the United States had evolved as a frontier society removed from almost everything, Americans often enunciated principles like Declaration of Independence. Declaration basically, according to Bush, was a PR gimmick to get France to fund the American Revolution. Because all it is just filled with all ideas of the French Revolution. Fine, this is what we stand for, they give us the dollars. They got the dollars, they won the war. Okay. Cool. Okay. Or we stand for freedom of the seas. Oh, you do? Okay, in come the Netherlands, in come Russia, Denmark, Spain. They don't trade with us. Well, of course, what happens as soon as we get independent? Now, you got a little problem with this freedom of the seas stuff here, okay? So we could enunciate ideas like all men are created equal. All these cool ideas that resonated with French Revolution concepts. But we have always been, from the beginning, right up through the 60s, a very pragmatic, practical people. End justifies the means. And when you reach an end that is contradicted by your very principles, you just find a way to get around it. Well, we really didn't mean it quite like that. Well, 14 due process, yeah, it's designed to protect the corporations, but you really never was intended to be applied to reasonably free black people. Okay, that's a way to get around it, isn't it? So on and on and on. This theme runs through those three logics. We've always been a very practical people. When we had to get involved in World War II, despite the fact that we didn't want to go, when we did get in after Pearl Harbor bomb, after Japan bombed us at Pearl Harbor, no country has ever geared up for war as fast as this one did. Nothing comes comparable to the American mobilization for World War II. But now, Chrysler made Jeeps like no one could ever believe. Even outstripped Willis. Okay? Ford made Jeeps. I made Jeeps. Okay? They're still all over the continent, those Jeeps. At the same time, Worsted says, we have another point of stress or contradiction that runs through our character historically. Individual versus community. But it tracks with this pragmatism versus principle. We have always talked about community. Let's see. City on a hill. That sounds like community, doesn't it? Mayflower Compact. That sounds like community. Declaration of Independence. We the people. That sounds like community. We're a people. Okay. Look at Gettysburg Address. Community. Look at all the major speeches. Look at John Kennedy's. Ask not what you can do for you, ask what you can do for your nation. Ask not what your nation can do for you, ask what you can do for your nation. Community, community, community. Okay. Patriotism, patriotism, patriotism. But he says, once again, that has more of a reality in rhetoric. That we live by the standards of community only so long as those standards of community are premised on the individual's right to do his way or her way. If the community reveres individualism, we like community. But if the community asks for individuals, not asks, requires individuals to do something for the community, like pay taxes, volunteer for the military, volunteer for non-military public service. Now, after a tornado, nobody requires their neighbor to go help the neighbor whose house was blown up. People volunteer. Sense of community, because it's not required, okay? And as all of us have experienced, an outpouring of individual help. That when the people in the Panama City area, the last hurricane that affected these people, over near Auburn University in Lee County, Alabama, just recently, 23 people killed. Just an outpouring of help. The state of Alabama will not pass a tax to increase the amount of money to put into the life insurance program of a first responder. They won't. Of a state trooper. But the people will go out of their way to put jars at the cash register at the grocery store to raise money for the family of a fallen police officer. Because they're not required to. He doesn't refer to that. That's all happened. You all know the story I'm talking about. It's very tragic, horrible, very sad thing with the police officers. Truth is, that happens to police officers all over America about once a day. Okay, once a day. And the fire people fire them too. I mean, they're literally living in a war zone. They're far more dangerous than most of our soldiers have in the law. So, no desire to control guns, because that cuts into the individual rights. There is a me versus us or them that runs through the American character. So, what Borstin concludes on the basis of these two things is that the Americans in general simply have no problem with contradictions or principles not upheld. No problem. We the people, well, I mean all the people. We don't mean women, we don't mean red people, we don't mean black people, all that. We're talking about, at that time, we're not going to talk about, we're not talking about even all white men. We're talking about white men and all property. No, there's also, you know, the few caveats we have to put in. But he also sees this, while he sees it as a consistent thread, the end justifies the means. He sees it as a source of conflict because a certain portion of the population actually believes the enunciated principles, actually believes political rhetoric as founding ideas of the nation. So you have a certain percentage of the population that, Franklin Graham, evangelical minister, strongly believes in all the 10 Commandments, but will support politicians who break all the 10 Commandments. Wonder why? Because his coffers are filled by people who write in sending checks because of his enunciating and contradictory position. Because his people are contradictory. I'm not putting myself above this. I'm sure God filled with contradictions. As a kind of quintessential American. I feel sure of that. If I think of all of them, I'll email you this weekend. Okay, so I'm off the hook here. So I sound holier than that, and I don't put myself in that. So, all right. So, from tonight forward to the end of the course, we're gonna see a lot of contradictory stuff. And I hope you don't get cynical. I hope you don't hear me saying, great ideas about helping human beings are bunk. I hope you don't turn cynical. For those of you who are religious, or maybe you're Christian, you face this every day. Are we really supposed to do what Jesus said, or was just Jesus kind of putting a standard out there for us to have something to reach to, but Jesus doesn't really expect us to do all that stuff? Okay. You can plot it within any religious group, say the same thing. I'm not singling out Christians, not any means, okay. But the great Mohammed had wanted IEDs exploded, killing all these American soldiers. Well, according to ISIS, yeah, he'd be okay with it. But I know a lot of Muslims who say that one was what he had in mind. Okay. So, let's start. Don't forget that name, Daniel Borstein. I'm not suggesting you go read it, but he's got great ideas that really help you, deepen your understanding. Those of you who have been cynical about America, or who don't like certain things, or don't understand it, it's at least an intellectual model to help you bring everything together. So you understand the whole, not just the pieces of the fabric, the thread, but the entire fabric. And as this reaction against the 60s picks up steam in the late 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and 2013 and 2019, you see this, even though Borstein has been dead since 2012, his writing is more relevant today than ever before. All right. Let's go with Griswold to start. Last case I put on the syllabus of the Warren Court, Vial 433. This is a really interesting case that shows this. All right. Facts. Facts concern the constitutionality of state of Connecticut's birth control law. Statute, this is a 65 case, birth control goes on the market late 1960, early 1961. And it just, sort of a riveting part of the 1960s, because it creates sexual and gender liberation. Okay? And there are a lot of people who did not want that liberation. It allows women to go into the workplace and have careers like never before. And men were having to compete with them, and they resented that. The statute provided, quote, any person who uses any drug, medical article, or instrument for the purpose of preventing conception is subject to fine or imprisonment of both. It's as if the Pope had written the law. Okay. The statute is paraphrased. The statute further specifies that the person who assists in another committing any offense can be prosecuted and punished. Estelle Griswold, Executive Director of Planned Parenthood, Connecticut. This was planned, like nearly all these big cases. They're set up in advance with a large organization behind them with money to hire work. And WCP, Planned Parenthood. They're not just citizens who just go after the court. Okay. Except in the case of the BMW case over here. Question. Is the Connecticut statute making birth control illegal valid under the Constitution? The Supreme Court says no. 7-2 vote. The greatest liberal on the court on this time, perhaps alongside Black, writes the opinion. First, the appellants, remember, it's Griswold versus Connecticut. Okay. First, the appellants held to have standing to raise the constitutional issue because they were accessories to violation of the criminal statute, meaning Connecticut law. As they were advising married persons as to the means of preventing conception. Planned Parenthood was giving out free birth control pills, okay? The decision established a new constitution right of privacy, and this gets really interesting. It goes to first, third, fourth, fifth, and most interesting, in the 14th, but most interesting, the 9th Amendment. The court noted that the specific guarantees in the Bill of Rights formed by the emanations from these guarantees that help give them life and substance, the right of privacy, which presses for recognition here, is a legitimate one. There's nothing in the Constitution that says, that has the word privacy. But in the 9th Amendment, the last one, before we get number 10. Here's what the 9th Amendment said. The enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Point, just because, in this case, just because the right of privacy is not stipulated in the Constitution, does not mean the people don't have it. If you could come up with a right that's not mentioned in the Constitution, and it fits philosophically with some of the ideas behind the Constitution, you got a shot. Amendment 9 is your go-to baby. Now they argued that, notice the way they use those, the majority opinion, the first, third, fourth, fifth, 9th, and 14th Amendments all were involved in that decision. Because the 14th Amendment, according to the reinterpretations that Black and others have given it, was used as a vehicle for saying that the federal government can enforce basic rights on the state level. The present case then concerns a relationship lying within the zone of privacy created by several constitutional guarantees. We deal with a right of privacy, get this, older than the Bill of Rights. It's that inherent right of privacy. It's older than the Constitution. It's something we have to revere. It's something endemic to our cultural values. And there's nothing in the Constitution that restricts privacy. So according to the 9th Amendment, it's something that we can honor and revere. You know, and it relates to freedom of expression, freedom of religion, a lot of things. People come up to your door and want to proselytize it, and you don't want them there, so you appear butt naked. Okay. We deal with the right of privacy older than the Bill of Rights. In the course of the opinion, the court referred favorably to the 9th Amendment provision that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights, just because we list certain rights, does not mean that there aren't other rights that the people have. Justice Goldberg concurred, emphasizing the 9th Amendment. Justice Black, Justice Stewart, Potter Stewart, had dissents distinguishing between them. That's very interesting. One ultra-liberal and one moderate to conservative dissented. Justice Black, the great libertarian, dissents off the distinguishing between the wisdom or unwisdom of a law and its constitutionality. Neither of the dissenting, Black and Stewart, could find specific constitutional authority for the court's discovery of a right to privacy within the Constitution. In other words, Black said, yeah, you can argue that since the 9th Amendment says there might be some other rights, just because they're not mentioned, but they're important. Black says, no. If it's not mentioned as a right, then the Constitution doesn't have respect for it. And here's one of the great defenders of privacy and free speech in American history saying this. So here's the case of a great ideological liberal on constitutional grounds taking the side of what is normally perceived to be the conservative position. In other words, he was not going to be political and vote with his buddy Douglas and several others who come in with FDR and Lyndon Johnson, John Kennedy. Decided conservative. Now, note, Powell puts in, the right to privacy that this decision recognized became the cornerstone of the key abortion decision, Roe v. Wade. And that's the reason I wanted us to focus on this particular case. Here's why. It becomes the key case in Roe v. Wade. All right. So, look at the debate we're in here. Black, the great liberal, takes in effect the conservative position, sociologically, on constitutional grounds. And several of the so-called conservatives took the liberal position. Now they might have argued that it was liberal constitutional. I have to argue it's liberal constitutional. They're saying just not everything's in the Constitution. This is word by the Constitution. It may be considered. The right of privacy predates the Constitution. Even though it didn't say that it is. To me, that's a liberal interpretation of as liberal as you can get. And they struck down what was perceived to be a conservative law, so that's a liberal political action as well. Conservatives. All right. Lemon versus Kurtzman. (1971). Rhode Island, Pennsylvania established programs designed to provide state aid to parochial, in this case Catholic, elementary and secondary schools. Pennsylvania reimbursed those schools for the cost of teacher salaries, texts, and materials used in teaching secular subjects. Rhode Island paid teachers of such subjects up to 15% of the salaries. In both cases, the states intended to see the money was given only for instruction related to secular subjects, trying to stay clear of the separation of church and state. A three-judge U.S. District Court had held that the Rhode Island law violated the Establishment Clause, whereas a similar court had upheld the Pennsylvania law. Of course, the Establishment Clause is the Freedom of Religion Clause, okay? So, question. Do the state programs in question violate First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, as applied to the states via the 14th Amendment due process? And B, what is the appropriate test to be applied in such cases? They decide 7-1. We'll get to their abstention in just a minute. That they did violate the Freedom of Religion Amendment 1. The court will examine Establishment Clause cases under a three-pronged test. This is called the Lemon test. It's just still extremely relevant, under which it can determine whether something has a secular purpose or religious purpose. 1, does it have a secular purpose? 2, is the effect of the law to inhibit religion? And 3, does the law foster excessive entanglement between church and state? That's what they look at when they decide if something is in violation of freedom of religion. It goes through the Everson case, but bottom line was the religious atmosphere of parochial schools in both states is pervasive, strongly Catholic states. Although the state can ascertain the content of secular textbooks relatively easily, teachers cannot be so easily overseen. When a teacher acts in good faith, there's a possibility they will impermissibly foster religion. coming up in the Alabama legislature to vastly increase the amount of Christian education in Alabama's public school classrooms. Can you imagine that occurred if the majority religion of Alabama was Muslim? Not a chance, okay? But it's rationalized under freedom of religion. They should just be more direct and say, we believe that we're a Christian state and we want Christian ethics taught in the classroom. They should just be more direct and say that. They might even win with this court by saying that, I'm not sure. Justice Douglas's concurrence, he agrees. Pennsylvania and Rhode Island laws are there. Concurrence also focused on entanglement. Justice Brennan agreed, and if these cases disagreed with the aid of the court sanction in the companion case, Tilson versus Richardson. Justice White, who also agreed, but pointed to the dual roles of parochial schools in performing religious and sexual functions. So, in other words, you've got a strong majority, but within that majority, you do not have a uniformity of opinion. The three-pronged Lemon test continues to be highly controversial. The court does not apply the test to all establishment clauses. There's an Indiana case that I may get to later on that helps deal with this. Okay. All right, let's keep going. Baker versus Nelson, 1972.
On the syllabus, it says internet case.
I'm sorry?
On the syllabus, it says internet case, so it might not be that one.
It was an internet case. Yeah, that's right. Hold that, and we'll come back to it. I remember this case. Hold it, let's go on, and we'll come back. It is an internet case. Neither Kyle or Hoffer treated it. And we'll come back to it as a precedent in another case. The reason I played off, we'll come back and use it. Okay, let's go on to Roe v. Wade. All right. Here we go. Roe v. Wade. All right. All right. We go to page, really 438. Of course, this is a big landmark case. And in the popular culture, it's viewed as the case that made abortions constitutional. That's not so, as we find in the case. It's much more refined and slicing and dicing than that. Texas statutes prohibited abortions except by medical advice for the purpose of saving the life of the mother. The woman proceeding under the pseudonym of James Lowe instituted a federal class action against the district attorney of Dallas County, challenging the validity of the state's law. Because the pregnancy did not threaten her life, she could not retain a legal abortion in Texas. Again, this was set up with big backing, large organization, money's paid for the lawyer. Okay. To reiterate, very few of these cases get to the court without backing of money, which is sad because your average John or Jane Schmo, the U.S. citizen, sometimes has legitimate causes, but they don't have the money to hire the lawyer to get access to justice. So they have to go out and get networked with some basically political action committee to advance the case. And we really just don't have the know-how or the confidence to make this happen. Okay. All right. Question. Does the term person as used in the 14th Amendment include the unborn. Now, remember all those 14th Amendment cases we had in the 1870s and 1880s, where we see the Supreme Court conclude that corporations are part of what was intended under the word person in the 14th Amendment. Okay? So, we have precedent for black people or persons. So, theoretically, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments apply to them. All justice systems. Generally accepted. You get to one versus Illinois, corporate cases. And yeah, corporations are protected too. Now the question was keep expanding the role of 14D. You can't be denied your due process. So can an unborn fetus be considered protected under 14th Amendment due process? That's the question. Answer, well, there are two questions. And does the right of privacy include a woman's decision on abortion? Okay. The answer was the term person as used in the 14th Amendment include the unborn. And this is the deceptive answer you're going to find. By 7 to, well, not totally, but the majority opinion was no, it doesn't. And yes, at least in the second trimester of pregnancy, the woman has a right to privacy. Now, it gets real dicey in here. All these people have different opinions as to how they arrive at what they arrive at. Blackmun writes the opinion, the Constitution does not define person. That was cool, because they never would have gotten out of the convention if they had. Right? Because they would have had to deal with the question of black slavery. So they skipped around defining person. Whoever's got the political power, they're the people. And whoever the politically powerful don't want voting, they're not people. Very pragmatic. Okay. We the people, asterisk, I'm not gonna tell you who they are. Because we're gonna change over time, right? Okay. We the people. The Constitution does not define person. However, the use of the word in the various instances where it is used in the Constitution is such that the word has application only to postnatally. It'd be very interesting to apply this same thought to definition of the word arms, the right to bear arms. AK-47s are not mentioned in the Constitution. It just depends on what justice wants to do what with words at a given time. Unborn have never been recognized in the law as persons in the whole sense. They can't sign a will, they can't inherit something, they can't get a driver's license, they can't vote. We need to resolve the difficult question of when life begins. When those trained in respective disciplines of medicine, philosophy, and theology are unable to arrive at any consensus, the judiciary, Chief Justice, at this point in the development of man's knowledge, is not in a position to answer this question. So they're basically punting on at what point does life start? At what point are you a person? But this doesn't keep them from making any judgment. Abortion laws largely came out of the 19th century. They've been explained as attempts to discourage illicit sex, to protect the health of a woman at times when procedure often posed health risks that were greater than carrying pregnancy, pregnancy and to protect prenatal life. B, the Constitution does not explicitly recognize any right to privacy. Right? We just had a case about privacy. The Ninth Amendment says just because we don't list it, doesn't mean it isn't there. Justice Burke disagrees with the majority, accepted it. However, for years, the court has recognized a right of personal privacy under the Constitution. Here's law. This has been primarily based upon the 14th Amendment concept of personal liberty and the 9th Amendment reservations of the rights of the people. The right is non-qualified and is subject to state regulation and important interests intervening. So they're not denying the right of a state legislature to regulate abortions. Okay? And all sorts of qualifications in this. The right of privacy is broad enough to cover the decision as to an abortion. The right is not absolute, however, and is subject to state interests as to the protection of health, medical standards, and prenatal life. Look at all of the refinements of within the decision of no and yes, forget. Pregnancy can be divided in 3 months, a trimester. Of course, this is the most long-term and most controversial part of the decision. The trimester concept is a huge matter of debate even today, with cases pending before the court. During the first period, there's no agreement as to the fetus being a person. And there is a case coming up to the court now that says life, humanity exists at the moment of conception. Okay. Yeah. There's a man from Texas who is suing his, understandably, former girlfriend for terminating a pregnancy a day after conception. And he is suing that woman for murder. Okay? And the court is going to wind up getting that case. It's coming on up. Right? He even named that which was terminated after he named her Joan Doe, after Jane Doe in this case. Ironic or maybe bizarre thing to do, but that's what he did. 3 months. During the first month, there's no agreement as to the fetus being a person, and risks to women from abortion are not greater than the risk of childhood. So the discretion test with the woman, the discretion rests with the woman in the position. During the second trimester, the health risks to women from abortion increase sufficiently to justify state regulations and procedure to protect such health. During the final trimester, when the fetus is viable and can sustain life inside the womb, the state may even prescribe abortions except when necessary, prescribe, meaning block abortions, except when necessary to preserve the life of the mother. White and Rehnquist. Mr. Rehnquist is on the scene now. Okay. Authored dissents questioning federal intervention in this area. Previously left to the states, and further questioning the application of the 14th Amendment. Now, here's Rehnquist saying this falls under the heading totally of state rights, despite the way the fact the majority of opinion was written, which under certain circumstances makes you want to respect the right of the states to regulate. Rehnquist is saying we have no business in this case whatsoever. The state of Texas has a right to decide its own issues. Now, what does Rehnquist do in this case? He walks all over state rights. The Florida Supreme Court ruled there should be an extension of time for the counting of the disputed ballots in this election. Florida Secretary of State high-level member of the Republican Party, sued to enforce the cutoff date that she was authorized to implement. Supreme Court rules that the U.S. Supreme Court has no right to intervene. But the U.S. Supreme Court has the right to determine how those votes will be counted. No problem. We're not bothered by contradiction. Okay? Very practical. This is where the decision that Rehnquist won. No problem with inconsistency.
So Rehnquist was angry, right? They talk about in the book, he was like angry at the Florida State Supreme Court.
He wouldn't have admitted that he was.
Right, but
But
his
I want to emphasize, it may sound like I'm taking a lot of shots at him. I happen not to agree with what he did. But he was a brilliant guy. And just to put him in perspective, his opposite on the court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was one of his closest friends. They went to opera together. They read Latin together on Saturday night. That's a real friendship, to read Latin together. Okay. Come on, I don't know if they're going to English to Latin or Latin English, but either one, it's not my concept of a cool Saturday night. But I mean, he's dead, she's not. They were both supreme intellectuals and had a very close bond, despite they had opposite political views of America and interpretation of the Constitution. So I don't want to put this guy down as some kind of Neanderthal, okay? Nothing like that. But his career, this gives us a great chance to talk about, his career had emerged straight up through the Republican Party of Nixon and Reagan. Okay? He had worked in the Attorney General's office. He had been a staff attorney for the White House. He had been a leading executive of the Republican Party. Don't forget, also a brilliantly trained legal mind from Stanford University. So, to put it mildly, no dummy. But he was also a conservative political activist. And again, no problem with contradiction. Throughout his career as Chief Justice, he didn't do it before him, as Chief Justice, he could have a case pending that they were going to decide on. They might have already heard oral arguments and gone into conference. And then get a big social invitation from one of the plaintiffs or the defendants. Like, we'd really like you and your family to come to Louisiana, to our plantation, to go duck hunting for 2 weeks. And we will wine and dine you. I mean, that's considered something. I mean, they were buying him off.
Yeah.
And he would say, no, I object. But he's the first justice to ever do that as flagrantly as he did. Now, one of the appointments that Lyndon Johnson made, Forrest ultimately resigned because he couldn't take the disdain he got from other justices for being suspect of taking favors, okay? He just left guilty by admission. But Rehnquist had an agenda. The Republicans' conservative agenda. And no, I'm objecting. The appearance of it, the members of Congress, obviously Democrats, but some of the Republicans were just appalled when the New York Times does a story. There's literally, it's already been decided, he's going to write the opinion in the case. And it's down in Louisiana, duck hunting and fishing with the plaintiff. No, I'm objecting. So, he was pursuing Reagan's vision of turning back the clock pre-1963, 64, 65, pre-1960, all was liberal reform. That was his mission. And yet he and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, just like that, close friends. So I can argue he's a political hack, I can argue he's just really complicated. But my point here, not to editorialize on Rehnquist, my point here is that the decisions, as Weil gives them, a flat no and a flat yes, it is much more complicated than just saying, does the term person is used in the 14th Amendment include the unborn? No. Does the right of privacy include a woman's decision on abortion? Yes. It's just, there's so many other wrinkles in that than just no, yes. And those wrinkles that are in there are now the basis for a lot of the cases that are coming up before the court. They're obviously more aggressive in trying to block abortion. Okay. And the idea of the third trimester, those who are right to life, it's very interesting, the right to life movement is the strongest in the states that have the highest number of infant mortalities between the ages of 1 and 5. So where does the right to life apply to a person? When all these babies are dying because of no inoculations and poor health care. Okay. Let me bring up another one. It relates to this. There's going to be a case that comes out of Oregon and Washington over measles. Oregon and Washington have currently, right now, are being slaughtered by an epidemic of measles. You may have seen on TV this young man, college age now, when he was 12, he went against his parental advice and slipped out and got a measles shot. And he's alive today in the middle of the measles epidemic from the Northwest. Now, there happens to be a large contingency of people up there who believe that inoculation for measles creates all sorts of problems, and it's also a myth. Okay? So they do not get their children a measles shot. Now, watch what happens. You're going to find this. Yet they let their children go to school, public school, where they spread the epidemic. Okay? And then children die from measles. So at what point, back to Munn versus Illinois and other things. And right here, the road. At what point does the state's right or constitutional obligation come in to exert police power to either mandate, after all, both California and the U.S. government mandated putting Japanese inside barbed wire, okay, during the war. At what point does a state government or the national government step in and regulate this the way it regulated corporate power, slavery, whatever? Because that measles is as toxic as it is bio-warfare. It's bio-warfare. Warfare implies intentional death, but the net effect is that. But right now, so that case, it's starting to work. Constitutional right of someone not to get inoculated, the constitutional right of someone to block the non-inoculated from going into the public sphere. Stay in the private sphere, that's your business. That'll be a really interesting case. Yes?
There was something recently, I want to say, maybe, I think I've heard at least one state and maybe one nation in Europe, but they're starting to crack down on banning non-vaccinated kids from school.
Yeah.
Like, if you're not vaccinated.
Oh, that can
you can't
happen
go to
in Europe easily.
I want to say I heard it was like Italy.
Or Germany can do it too.
Germany.
But in France, they've done something very parallel. England's done it too. It's very effective in England because England's an island. They have ended rabies. There is, I don't know if you saw the news, there was another rabies spike out in Fairhope this past week, out where 104 runs into 181. Fox Little one, and she's going through all the rabies treatment. It's no fun. Okay, that is a horrible experience. And checked, that was like 4 or 5 days ago. All right. There is no rabies in England and France. Some maybe slips across the border from Germany and England particularly. Why? Because the government mandated a program 4 times a year. They put a certain type of food all over the countryside that has an inoculation in it that all wild animals eat. And within 10 years of this program, all the cases of rabies just stopped. And it's been proposed here repeatedly. You know the response? We don't want government telling us what to do. So this woman's over there in the hospital trying to figure out how she's going to deal with rabies. Now, that's fair enough. If your elected officials vote not to do it, that's the way the Constitution reads, okay? But there's almost no rabies in all of Europe because of this program. Ultimately, the World Health Organization got behind it, except in the United States where the World Health Organization information was turned away as myth. Okay. I won't get on changes in the weather. Okay. Let's keep going. U.S. versus Nixon, 1974. This, I don't know if Trump's case on documents and his income taxes will get to the court before this class is over or not. It could be. If John Roberts wants it to happen, it will. Here's Nixon. Here's Nixon. All right, I'm on page 72 involved. Fascinating case. And this, here you're going to find Rehnquist not participating on the grounds that he was part of the Nixon, the right thing for him to have done. Okay? All right. As a result of a break-in of the Democratic National Committee, headquarters in Watergate Complex in Washington, D.C., the investigation subsequent trial of a number of persons disclosed that President Nixon himself had taped an indefinite note of conversation in the Oval Office, the White House. And the special prosecutor over the Watergate break-ins wanted those tapes. It's so odd. Nixon was a beautifully educated writer. You don't get into the Duke Law School and do well without being really smart. Okay? Nixon was a graduate of Duke Law School and did extremely well. First thing, let's talk this case I gave you last meeting with the student of eighth evidence. Okay? Everybody have a chuckle about it. I chuckle too, because I don't have to admit it. Lawyers don't like paper trails. I've written 2 biographies of lawyers. They are hard to research because they destroy the breadcrumbs because they know what paper trails can do. Okay? Nixon had his secretary, Rosemary somebody, it's usually referred to as a Rosemary tapes, in control of a tape recorder at her desk. And that tape recorder had a line that ran all the way underneath the carpet, all the way under the door, into the Oval Office, underneath Nixon's desk, and up underneath a drawer. And whenever Nixon wanted a secret record of a conversation he was having, he just reached out and turned on the tape recorder. And the secretary's job was A, not to tell anyone, but B, transcribe the things. And believe it or not, when this case started, he never told her to destroy transcriptions on the tapes. So the special prosecutor in this case says, we want the tapes. He says, nope, and the tapes were gonna show that he had ordered the break-in to the Democratic National Convention headquarters. He said, no, and instead of destroying them, and he could have been sent to jail at that time for destroying evidence. But before it's evidence, he could have destroyed them, and that's good. He says, executive privilege, you can't have them. Thus the case, do the documents become protected by executive privilege? Can a federal court order the chief executive of the United States to surrender material that the president wants to withhold as a matter of executive privilege? The answer, yes. Applauded by both Democrats and Republicans, and Nixon being a Republican. Applauded by both. Would that happen today? Interesting, okay. Chief Justice Berger, 8-0. Jay Rehnquist not participating. He recused himself because he was closely identified with Nixon. He had worked for all these Republican organizations helping elect Richard Nixon, and of course Nixon put him on the court. Rehnquist appropriately recuses himself. So it's an 8-0 vote. Notice you've got liberals and conservatives all voting together. No question, executive privilege has its limits. No question. The Constitution does not contain any explicit reference to an executive privilege's confidentiality. The president shares not only in the generalized right to privacy that others have, but also in his need for confidential advice. In a case like this involving a criminal trial, the needs of fair administration of justice have to be balanced against the importance of the president's need for confidentiality. While taking note of the doctrine of separation of powers, the court observed that there is no unqualified presidential privilege of immunity from the judicial process under all circumstances. Read Article 2, powers of the president, as providing an absolute privileges against a subpoena essential to enforcement of criminal statutes on no more than a generalized claim of the public interest confidentiality of non-military, non-diplomatic discussions. Boy, that's a bad sentence. Would upset, looks like something Richard Will Faulkner would write, okay? Like, except he put in a lot of C codes, okay? Keep on going for about another 4 paragraphs. It would upset the constitutional balance of a workable government. Now, sooner or later, Trump's destiny will lay on the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court on any number of issues. This case will be a real precedent. We'll see how the lawyers for him handle the case. And he's got some brilliant lawyers now. He got rid of all the bad ones. Well, he fired one of the really good ones, brought in some bad ones, and now he's hired a couple of really sharp characters. And it'll be interesting to see how they deal with this and his use of executive privilege. There's a case in the Bush 2 era where they will use. There was a suit against Cheney, Bush's vice president, over the energy policy. When Bush comes in, of course, Texas oil helped put it in. He asked Cheney to chair a committee to develop an energy policy for the United States. Who is on his committee? 5 CEOs of oil companies. What do you think the report is going to say? Like oil on public lands, that kind of stuff. When the press and the Democratic Congress asked to see the report, Cheney said, no, this is confidential. And even though he was vice president, asserted executive privilege. And the court, by that time, had shifted to the right enough. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the vice president has executive privilege. Court upheld Cheney's refusal to show the American people the content of the energy report. Okay? So, they'll probably will use that. We'll see. Of course, Nixon came down with this. When the tapes were made public, it was clear that Nixon had done it. He was impeached, and very interesting. The person who was given the job of going to tell him that the jig was up was a senior senator from Alabama, John Sparkman, who was a Democrat, but who knew him so well. And Sparkman went down to the Oval Office and said, Dick, you've been impeached in the House. The votes are in the Senate to confirm. The vast majority of Republicans are going to vote with the Democrats to convict because you've broken the law. You need to resign. And he goes on TV the next night and says, fortunately, he didn't say victory with honor. What he said when he left Vietnam, he said, he blamed some people and said, I'm out of here. And that's the way it all ended. Regents of the University of California versus Bakke. What a bellwether case this is. Really interesting. There it is. I'm on page 672 in Bakke. Now, the question here is affirmative action. Most of you know the meaning of that word. Is a snapshot history of it. When the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which we've talked about, John F. Kennedy conceived of it, assassinated in November of 1963. Lyndon Johnson ascends to the Oval Office as Vice President, and Lyndon Johnson pushes through the 64 Civil Rights Act. Well, we've looked at that act primarily in terms of public accommodations, restaurants, hotels, barbecue stands, etc. But there's a specific section in the 64 Civil Rights Act that pertains to getting more underrepresented minorities into public higher education. And this led, and it's not mandated in the Civil Rights Act, but this led many higher education entities, primarily public, but some privates that were receiving federal aid through national contracts, to put in place quotas for a certain number of black people or women or red people or whatever that would make up freshman class or make up a graduate school corner. So this case is about quotas. And let me tell you, from 64 until this case in 1978, nearly all public universities had quotas on the number of underrepresented minorities. So, here we got the case of a Marine veteran, Alan Bakke, white male. He applied twice to get into medical school at UC Davis, a very good medical school. And since it's California, and he's a California citizen, he would have gone almost free. Virtually all higher education in California is paid for with taxes. If you can get in, you don't have to count a loan to put on. You may have to pay $2,000 a year. Otherwise, paying $50,000 a year. In other words, they have a different system. I don't recommend you try it, because your rent apartment will cost you $1,000 a year, will cost you $10,000 there. So, real estate cost. It's so expensive, if you get a faculty job at Stanford, they can't recruit you unless they give you free housing. They hold the mortgage on your home. They pay for 2/3 of the mortgage if you get a job as a professor at Stanford. That's how expensive real estate is. Okay. But for in-state people, that benefit in tuition is just unbelievable. Despite strong benchmarks, interviewer summaries, overall grade point average, MCAT scores, which have taken to medical school like LSAT or law school, letters of recommendation, et cetera, Mackey was rejected. UC Davis had 2 admission programs for its entering class of 100 students, the regular and the special admits. The special admits program set aside 16 seats in the first year medical school class for various racial minorities, and they did not compete with the other 84 slots who had to compete against each other. And they were not required to meet the GPA requirements of non-minorities. Bucky's overall scores were significantly higher than the special admit scores. He claimed that the UC Davis quota system violated the California Constitution, Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 64, which led universities to go to the quota system. Now, there was a large infrastructure to help him do this case. He didn't do this by himself. Gets up to the Supreme Court. Question: is the admission program of UC Davis that set aside 16 class positions for non-minority students unlawful? B, are considerations of race and admissions programs always unlawful? Yes and no. The admission program of UC Davis that set aside 16 class positions, is it unlawful? The answer is yes. Are all considerations of race and admissions unlawful? No. Justice Powell, who's appointed as a Virginia kind of old aristocratic conservative, but who clearly shifted to the left with age, voted with one majority on question A and voted against with another majority on question B. Reasons: it's 5-4. I told you these decisions are going to get dicier and dicier. It's 5-4 decision. The key point is classification denies an individual opportunity to benefit enjoyed by others solely because of their race or ethnic background and must be regarded as suspect. But you go down in this paragraph on page 478. But Title VI of the Civil Rights Act 64 prescribes only those racial classifications that would violate the Equal Protection Clause if employed by a state or its agency. California Supreme Court erred in holding that race can never be considered in evaluating an applicant. Remember, we're not talking about liberal California, okay? We're dealing with the case of California. This is Reagan's California. Much of California shifted to the right. That's the reason Reagan elected so long. California Supreme Court erred in holding that race can never be considered in evaluating an applicant. For the state has a substantial interest that legitimately may be served by properly devised admission program. Powell stressed that race, like considerations of other individual characteristics, could serve as a plus. Brennan leads the justices who would have permitted not only consideration of race, but quotas. Stevens led those justices thought that Title VI of Civil Rights Act 64 made it clear that Congress did not intend to approve considerations of race. So, the net effect is admissions can consider race, but quotas, in this case, that discriminate against our Marine veterans and future doctors. Extreme quotas. They left the door open for moderate quotas to be interpreted later. Stay tuned. Now, this is viewed as a bellwether case because, as we're going to find at the next meeting, more and more affirmative action programs in all areas not just higher education, are slowly being cut back by the court. I'll tell you about two cases. One we're gonna look at the next meeting. This case out of Shelby County, Oliver, Shelby County, Alabama. It's right there. Directly relates to this. Shelby County, as a county that had significant racial discrimination in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, like most of the counties in Alabama, remained, after even 2020, subject to federal oversight in all issues relating to public policy and race, particularly voting. Federal referees would be their chicken on all the voting. Now, that didn't keep the state legislature from redrawing the voting district, gerrymandering Shelby County to cut out a lot of black people from voting in certain districts. Feds can't touch that. And the court just recently said, what states do with their gerrymandering is their business. This current court said that. But Shelby County had a affirmative action program for awarding construction contracts to construction businesses. And as a result of the civil rights oversight, they had put in place a modified quota system saying that a certain number of contracts for like paving or building schools or whatever would need to go to minority contractors. White contractors sued on the grounds that, in this case, the African American contractors were extremely successful in Shelby County. They'd gotten a lot of the work because they were just good at what they did. And there was no need for there to be a civil rights agenda on publicly awarded contracts in Shelby County. So withdraw the affirmative action requirements. Court agreed. Okay? Court agrees. So you see, well, you can see the pro and the con. If you're a civil rights veteran, you interpret this as an erosion of changes brought about by the civil rights movement. If you come at it from another standpoint, you say, how wonderful that we no longer need affirmative action on race. Okay? How wonderful that's the case. So, very complicated. And another case that relates to this, very similar. One of my daughters involved in, she was working for a federal judge in Houston. And as the clerk, she was given the job of writing a brief on the following case. In one particular school district, Houston's so large, it has several school districts. In one particular school district, a suit was brought to drop all affirmative action considerations in the hiring of public school teachers, K through 12. And the judge asked my daughter, all right, would you research this case and bring me your brief? The judge was graduate Cornell, moderate to conservative leaning, brilliant, beautifully educated. And she told, when she called my daughter in for the conference, she said, I believe these people have a point. My daughter researched it, finds the following. In one particular segment of public education in Houston, there was simply no need for affirmative action considerations. None. And it was clearly discrimination against white males who were applying. Clearly. The plaintiffs were arguing it because affirmative action was wrong and no longer needed in one particular section of Houston School District. It should be eliminated from all of Houston public education. So she wrote a brief saying they got a point as far as the specific component of education they're talking about is concerned. But I recommend that it not be applied throughout, because there's portions of Houston that simply are not like this one portion. Judge Bobbitt case came down that way, it was appealed to the Supreme Court. Really cool, her brief was upheld by the Supreme Court, which I think is really great, for family reasons. In other words, she prevailed as a law clerk. She affected the Supreme Court decision. And she was thrilled that she won. Okay. The judge never said thank you, but she felt like she got something else. So, let's keep going. Keep going. Planned Parenthood. We keep going with abortion here. All right. I'm on page 441 in file. You all probably know this case. I'll be brief. It's a huge case. You've probably heard of it. Pennsylvania adopted restrictions on abortions. Cameo explanation. Pennsylvania. When you think of Pennsylvania, don't think of Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a universe apart from the rest of Pennsylvania. Okay? Most of Pennsylvania is extremely rural. Outside of West Virginia, the highest pockets of poverty, unemployment, and opioid abuse are in Pennsylvania. Okay? This was once coal country. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh are like a different universe. The majority of voters in Pennsylvania are much more like the majority of voters in Alabama. Okay? Pennsylvania adopted, and that means the legislature. It's very simple. Pennsylvania adopted restrictions on abortions. These require informed consent and a 24-hour waiting period. Either the consent of at least one parent or the exercise of a judicial bypass mechanism in cases where minors for abortions. The requirement that a married woman sign a statement indicating that she had informed her husband of the decision, compliance with all the above requirements except in cases of medical emergencies. The U.S. District Court struck down all of these requirements, whereas when it was appealed to the U.S. Third Circuit Court of Appeals, it upheld all but the spousal notification requirement. The Bush administration saw this as an opportunity to overrule all of Roe v. Wade. That's what they hoped to happen. Question: are the regulations regarding abortions adopted by Pennsylvania constitutional? Should Roe v. Wade be overturned? Answer: yes, all are constitutional except for the spousal notification decision. They just thought that was absurd. No, the central holding of Roe v. Wade is reaffirmed. And this is really not, this is splitting hairs. Just, it gets more and more like that. O'Connor, Kennedy, Souter, 5-4 decision. These three justices, in part by Blackmun and J. Stevens, affirmed that the central holding of Roe v. Wade should be retained and once again reaffirmed. Now, notice Sandra Day O'Connor's there, a Reagan appointee and a devout Catholic. She's voting to affirm Roe v. Wade, the right to an abortion under certain circumstances. This holding consisted of the recognition of a woman's right to have an abortion without undue interference from the state prior to viability, the state's right to restrict abortion after viability, and recognition of state interest. In other words, they're not denying the state's role, but in certain circumstances, the right of a woman to have an abortion. The three justices right to abortion to the liberty clause of the 14th Amendment. Okay? It is the woman's liberty. And since it's the 14th Amendment, it applies to states. The woman's liberty for abortion at certain stages, even though under other circumstances, the state has a right to regulate it. The court contrasted the decision of Roe v. Wade to those of Lochner when we talked Plessy, providing, unlike those cases, they did not believe that Roe was based on disproven theories. Okay? Disproven theories. Roe v. Plessy was overturned by Brown versus Board of Education because he who argued the case for Brown, Board of Education, Thurgood Marshall, later appointed by Lyndon Johnson to the Supreme Court, could show that the underlying idea behind Plessy was wrong, incorrect, invalid. And they say there's nothing in this current case that shows the woman's right to liberty of a certain type of abortion is based on wrong information. The majority believe the only provision of Pennsylvania abortion law that created an undue burden was that of spousal notification, citing numerous studies showing that most wives already notify their husbands and arguing that for others, such notification might lead to either physical or psychological spousal abuse. And then you go through all these other rationales that different members of the court had. You get down to Rehnquist, he's not happy. He accused the majority, he's obviously in the minority, of retaining the outer shell of Roe v. Wade, but of being a wholesale retreat from the substance of the case. He wanted the case to overrule all of Roe v. Wade. He just couldn't believe, particularly Sandra Day O'Connor wouldn't go along with it. But she was looking at different angles in here. And Scalia, who's very conservative, also brilliant, his dissent attempted to answer one by one the arguments for the majority. And then later wrote a big article called Imperial Judiciary News, meaning this was just a gross intrusion by the federal court system into the state arena. All right. By the way, if you want to make a note on this, on pages 430 to 434, very good elaboration on this case. I really encourage that you take a look at it. We're getting close to the end. Just hang in there with me a little bit more. I'm going to be brief on this. It's a fun case, and it doesn't bear on the various things we've been working with. But Lyle has a brief on it. The essence. A Dr. Ira Gore of Birmingham, Alabama, a physician at St. Vincent's Hospital in Birmingham, a physician that specialized in terminal cancer patients. It's odd that you think that as a specialty, but his specialty is telling people they have no chance and making them comfortable as they die. Okay? That's what he does. Still doing it. And is beloved by families for whom he has done this very rough duty. Okay. He orders a BMW from Germany and comes to the port of New Orleans. When he gets it, he's given a document that says, car's in great shape. He signs off, takes it, drives it back to Birmingham. He finds shortly that the car had received some damage on board the boat, and at the port authority, BMW hired someone to paint it to cover up the damage. He sues. breach of contract, due process, everything, deception, wide-ranging. And he wins big in Alabama courts. They hire an attorney out of Anniston, who had contributed a lot of money to the election of various members of the Alabama Supreme Court. A pivotal issue not mentioned by law. In states where the Supreme Court, members of the state Supreme Court are elected, you tend to have huge verdicts for plaintiffs. In states where Supreme Court justices are not elected, they be often appointed by the governor, confirmed by the legislature, you don't have the huge verdict award of money. Okay. That's the reason Alabama has so many lawyers in it, because you can make so much money as a plaintiff's attorney. Okay. And the lawyers are organized to try to get certain people elected to the Supreme Court. Okay. So, Gore wins in the lower courts. BMW appeals, it goes up to the Alabama Supreme Court, and it's a jury trial, but the Supreme Court approves of the jury decision. It could have asked him to go back. And he's awarded both actual and punitive damages. The actual damages, $600. That's what was the net effect. It was just a little scratch. And that was the net effect on the depreciation value of the car. Punitive damages were in the $2 million range. Now, you understand how actual versus punitive works. Punitive means to punish. I had a leaky basement case, the first house I ever bought. I liked the house. It didn't have a cement floor in the basement. It had a sandy floor. But the sand was very dry. At the end of the first year, spring rains came. My canoe, my life jackets, and my paddles were floating around in the basement. I had a problem. 3 feet of water in my basement. I went next door, took an old codger who lived there for 40 years with a large bottle of amber liquid and got him to talk. That old man he bought that house from, he had a yard cutter, yard man. And before he put that house up, and every time before he let the realtor show it, he'd have that yard man shoveling dry sand in there. And that day you walked in, I saw you go in there, boy. He just put in another load of dry sand. A lawyer presented the videotape of the canoe floating through the basement. And the old man, having recovered from his amber liquid, agreed to testify. The judge awarded me $15,000 actual damages and $400,000 in punitive, and then called me and the defendant to the bench and said, "I'm not going to ask the defendant to pay punitive because it's 92 and I don't think he can recover from that. So you take your money, fix your basement." I knew I couldn't sell a house with a leaky basement, but fixing it, so I just added a deck on the back and advertised it, the house with a leaky basement. Sold it within 6 months for a beautiful deck, which I built myself up to save all my money. I put $3,000 in that deck. Okay. Beautiful deck, built it. That includes some tools I wanted to buy for a long time. Okay. Now, Gore's case, that's the difference between punitive and actual. You'll run into that some stage in your life if you haven't already. Don't go after an older person for punitive. The judge is gonna award it, so the precedent is there, but you're not gonna get your money. Go after someone young and poor. Okay, that's cruel, isn't it? Oh, cruel. All right. Case goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court. BMW wasn't about to go away. Deep Pockets, big lawyer team. Supreme Court struck down the punitive decision that came out of the Supreme Court. It's simply ludicrous and a symptom of how bad justice is in Alabama because of the way we select our judges. So he got to keep it $600. I don't know if he still has the BMW today. The irony is he didn't need the money, multi-millionaire decision. He just was interested to see if he could pull this off. Bush v. Gore. We'll do more on this in the next meeting, but let's talk about this. Please keep my funny mind, you've all read the book, these papers. This book takes a very contrarian view. Legal scholars, attorneys, ever since the Supreme Court decision basically gave the election of 2000 to George Bush and denied to Al Gore. The conventional wisdom within high-level legal circles that this was just a grossly politicized action on the part of the Supreme Court, and particularly Rehnquist, to just make sure the Republicans got their guy in the White House. And this book gives you all sorts of articles and critiques that argue that point. But this guy, Zeldin, who's probably the specialist on the Electoral College in the United States, that's what he does. He consults, he goes all over helping states deal with their Electoral College issues. This guy argues that the most tragic how screwed up the Florida Electoral College system was, how inadequate the Florida voting machines were. And mind you, the team of people who were in charge of the voting machines in Florida in 2000 were still there during the 2016 election, and they botched it again. No changes have occurred. Okay? And this is not a Republican-controlled bureaucracy that runs the voting machines. The person who is in charge of the voting machines is a Democrat. It was just gross ineptitude in counting votes. Please, I cannot be told. I want you to run from that one if there is. So, it has the sultry feeling. But his argument is the court ruled in a highly politicized way, typical of Reynolds, take care of the Republicans. He says that's not the main sad part. The sad part is the court simply announced that the Florida Supreme Court called for an extension of time to get all the votes counted. And if all the votes had been counted, there are two different analyses. One says it would have affected whether Bush would have been elected. But there's another account done by 5 different political scientists from 5 different universities, including the University of Chicago. They have a consortium that analyzes it. They say that Gore should have won. So you got competing definitions by social scientists who study this stuff, computer specialists. So regardless of all that, the Florida Supreme Court should have been allowed to, it's a state issue. The Florida Supreme Court should have been allowed to do what it wanted to do. It didn't. But at least in announcing that Bush had won, the Supreme Court could have at least written on a side that says, this is a symptom of how backwards and out of date the voting processes are all across America. It's out of date, it's unprofessional, in some places it's crooked, in other places it's just plain inept. Leaving the door wide open for our system to be manipulated by bad guys or by other powers not in the U.S. They didn't even, they had mandated, they tied to us a court order that said, states, clean up your voting processes. They could have helped the nation through one of the central crises that it has. It has a polarized voting public and more polarized to come, and a totally ineffective voting process. And he says, and that can forecast the end of our democracy. And we have no faith in the voting process. If you don't have faith in the voting process, you're easily manipulated by someone who says it's all rigged. That's just recently happened, okay? Because a lot of it is just totally inept. So the voting process has got to be made right and accurate, or the trust that comes from the voting process is the core of the democratic experience. If that falls apart, then we're wide open as to what we'll wind up needing. So that's its central point, okay? I look forward to reading reviews on that, and we'll come back to this at the next meeting. Consider the tornadoes coming through. In that case, I'll show you how to practice it. Watch your emails this weekend, please. Okay? And remember, we don't meet next week. You're on your spring break, or you're writing the paper, or whatever you're doing.